Welcome to the Journal of the Southwest Radio Hour, produced by the University of Arizona Southwest Center in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. I'm Jeff Banister. Today I'm talking with Dr. Natalia Mendoza-Rockwell, a professor of anthropology at Fordham University who researches the effects of drug and human smuggling on communities in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. Natalia spent a significant part of her childhood growing up in the Sonoran town of Altar, an important waypoint for migrants hoping to make it across the international border into southern Arizona. She has degrees from El Colegio de Mexico and Columbia University, and her interests range from linguistic anthropology and political theory to post-colonial intellectual histories of Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean. Natalia is only one of a handful of scholars who approach the politics and social geographies of smuggling from an ethnographic perspective. She is also a writer of vibrant prose and recently won Mexico's prestigious Jose Revueltas Literary Prize from the Instituto Nacional de Bellas Artes y Literatura for her collection of essays El extravío de los signos, tres ensayos sobre duelo y porvenir. This conversation was recorded via the internet during the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the background noise was unfortunately difficult to reduce. Natalia Mendoza, welcome to the JSW Radio Hour.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I have so many questions for you, and I'm so grateful to have you on our show this afternoon. One of the first things I wanted to talk about, though, is so you have your undergraduate degree from the Colegio de Mexico, and you've got a master's and PhD from Columbia University.
That's right.
And you're an anthropologist, right? And you work on a variety of different things. What I'm really interested in, though, is so you're born and raised in Mexico, and your research, writing, and activism seem to kind of express a profound concern to understand and respond to some of the kind of the most heart-wrenching and intractable problems facing our species: organized crime, the drug wars, human trafficking, kidnapping, and disappearance. You know, the list seems to go on. And I just would like to know. So, how were you drawn into this kind of work? What led you into all of this?
Well, I think everything started because my father's family is from Altar, and I used to go there all the time when I was a kid, and then I actually lived there with my grandmother when I was in junior high, and this was in the late 90s, and it was when Altar began to, it was just starting to become one main crossing point for migrants coming from southern Mexico and Central America. And so I kind of slowly, got to see in real time, so to speak, like all the kind of transformations that were happening year after year. I kept going back to Altar almost every year after that. And then when I finished my undergrad in Mexico City, I decided to do an ethnographic research project, and I went to Altar and I did my servicio social at the municipio. I don't know how you call that, but the kind of
the county seat or the municipal
county seat or the county office, yeah. And I was there for another whole year, more sort of directly doing research and interviewing different people, and that's what led to Conversaciones en el Desierto. This was 2004, 2005. Mm-hmm. So it was right before, the kind of the huge spike in violence took place in Mexico, which started in 2007.
Mm-hmm. With President Calderon.
Yeah, with President Calderon's decision to mobilize the army, in the so-called war on drugs. So I was able to see these different kind of moments in the history of the region of Altar and Caborca. And so I've seen it, and now we have a completely different situation also. So I have kind of this more or less long-term perspective on, 20 years of changes in the region. And a lot of that has to do with migration and extortion and the rise of the sicarios so what began as a more sort of like amateur drug traffickers. When I was a kid, I grew up hearing these stories about, drug traffickers. And these were more like the drug traffickers in those stories were kind of tricksters. They were like, like they had all these different sort of resources to hide and to mimic and to kind of smuggle. It was this it wasn't really violent. It wasn't something that we related to violence as much as to kind of ingenuity. And this, of course, is what changed. And now we have this kind of professional militia that controls every movement and all the circulation of people and commodities through the region. So this is what happened during these 20 years. And I've been basically just following those transformations.
Well, I was going to ask you too. So could you kind of walk us through that a little bit? So we have this transformation, this kind of arc of change over the 20 years that you've known this place. Can you kind of walk us through your observations and what was it like in the 90s, for instance, when you arrived there? What do you remember?
So I remember a lot of stories about local drug traffickers, local smugglers. The term narco wasn't even used that much. It was kind of mañoso, maña, these different terms. And it was these stories that produce a certain admiration, like it was this sort of like the dream of social mobility is what it was. We could see, like I had classmates in junior high who decided to go into the smuggling business and made it for a little bit, so we could see this like, these sort of like examples of like people who, would go from like rags to riches type of thing, right? Like, like it really implied a kind of huge social mobility for a kind of landless social class. It was, I think at the time, one of the huge sort of distinctions that people would make would be between the local smugglers and smugglers who were coming from other places in Mexico, specifically from Sinaloa. So it was like people accepted and admired and, and could sort of like establish social relationships or relationships of kinship with local ones. But there was this kind of sort of big fear and sort of fear and mistrust of those who were coming from Sinaloa and from Durango and from other places. And, this is one of the kind of the things that I noticed in my book at the time. And then, of course, what happened was that Altar became, because of changes in U.S. Border enforcement, and, Altar became a major crossing point for migrants, because of this sort of like funnel effect of pushing migrants towards the, more hostile areas of the desert. And so Altar, is not an urban center, is kind of a rural community, became a major crossing point. And I remember those years too. It was like, my grandmother couldn't believe what she was seeing. It was like, thousands and thousands of people, and the entire economy of the place, was transformed, and like all these, many people got very rich also very quickly with the hotels and the restaurants and, all these services to migrants. And there was this kind of boom that this was like maybe early 2000s up until 2010, 12. And then in 2010 is when I first heard the word sicario and cobra cuota. This was kind of like a novelty in town, and it was a new structure that was basically trying to attempt a monopoly of all the illegal activities in the town, and in particular, charging fees to undocumented migrants. So this is aside from the fee that the pollero or the smuggler charges. This is a fee that people have to pay. Up to now, migrants need to pay this fee in order to go through Altar. So this is a fee that it's paid to the mafia, and that it's not a small amount of money. It's this is one of the things that different groups are fighting over right now. It's kind of the right to charge those fees.
So it's a kind of a right to traverse the space in a way, right?
Yeah, well, actually, it has gone even further than that, because right now, in the kind of, I don't write about this in my book, but in research that I have done more recently, is the entire border line, the entire U.S.-Mexico border And in particular, that section between, let's say, Nogales and Sonoita is divided and it's owned. The border itself is owned by different groups. I mean, like they can draw you a map of like from this kilometer to this kilometer, it belongs to the Altar Mafia, which is also known as Los Cazadores or El Noveno. If you go from there to there, it belongs to Caborca. If you go further west, then it belongs to Sonorita. And so it's almost like a form of property of the border. And of course, the border becomes a sort of resource, an economic resource to be exploited by these groups, through by charging fees to not only migrants but also other drug traffickers. So right now, for instance, if a drug trafficker wants to use Altar, the border that belongs to Altar, he has to pay $10,000 a week to operate there. So it's like the territory itself has become a commodity.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Yeah, you write in your book, the Conversaciones en el Desierto, the popular portrayals of organized crime and the drug wars in Mexico are so often focused on cartels as kind of impermeable, in some ways, organizations that operate on the margins of or outside of society. And I know that there's room for a lot of nuance even in popular portrayals around that. Mm-hmm. But I think that I can see a lot of that in the way that people tend to talk about what's happening in Mexico. And but in the book, you describe a much more nuanced reality, and a lot of that is based on your ethnographic work and your own experience. But one thing I really appreciate on top of all of that is the way that you understand space as kind of an actor in all of this. That there's a sort of a transformation of both physical and in a lot of ways kind of mental space that happens in this whole process. So Altar is at one point a kind of a sleepy cow town in some ways. That the railroad doesn't even go through because it's so far out of the way. I guess the railroad that was run across the Sonoran Desert in the 1940s, and then the highway comes through in the 1950s, and it's made to go through Altar because these people realize that the town is kind of getting forgotten in some ways. So there's this long history of changes that you document. Mm-hmm. Then all of those have, real spatial geographic implications. Can you talk a little bit about that? Take us through that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I would have a lot of things to say about that. But so one interesting thing that I've been thinking about more recently is there's this very clear distinction in Mexico, in the region, between paved and unpaved roads. So it's almost like for instance, the term brecha is a term that is used locally in Sonora to refer to dirt roads. Mm-hmm. And from Altar to the border, what you have is a dirt road. It's la brecha. It's like a master brecha. It's like it's a dirt road that has remained unpaved, and it links Altar to Sázabe. Mm-hmm. And the whole identity of the local Altar Mafia is based around the control of brechas. It's like their power is in the brechas, in the dirt roads, mm-hmm. and the state power is in the paved roads. So there is a very clear kind of it's almost like an agreement. So there is this very clear kind of division of governance, so to speak, in which the Mexican government, through the army and the police, sort of controls, these kind of major infrastructures like paved roads and towns. But then as soon as you leave those, there is this kind of really complex sort of, system of dirt roads connecting one place to another place. And that's an entirely different world. I mean, it really is. And so you have songs, you have corridos. For instance, the leader of the mafia now in Altar has a song that it's called El Señor de las Brechas, which is the Lord of the dirt roads or something like that. So it's really like a kind of central aspect of their identity. This, this is their realm, their world is the dirt roads, like the backstage, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And then you have in terms of a spatial sort of phenomena, you have this whole thing that I just described about the division of the segmentation of the border into sort of pieces to be owned or segments to be owned by different groups and be exploited. You also have, on top of all that, it's the landed aristocracy in Sonora. And something that I think is really important and really interesting to notice is that you have this new class of, let's say, criminals, or these militia. These, I don't even know what to call them now, because it's really like a militia, that controls the territory. You have the rise of this new class. Most of them are young, very young men, and most of them are, I mean, all of them come from the lower social strata. Like, they started, like, the current leader. It's like he started as a driver of the vans that were taking migrants from Altar to Sasabe back in the early 2000s. I mean, they were drivers, and they were like sort of a working class. And now they are, they have risen, and they have become like really powerful and really wealthy, and they have bought ranches, and like they have an arsenal, an army. I mean, it's really impressive. But what is most interesting, I think, is that they have not displaced the landed aristocracy. They coexist with it. Mm-hmm. So that you can have hand to hand, like the same territory, the same space, like all that kind of the rural lands that extend from Altar to Sasabe, all of that kind of rural area, which used to be the Hono lands, can support at the same time, can be controlled by the sicarios and by cattle ranchers without much conflict between the two. So it's like the same space can be interpreted in terms of like land property and ranching, or it can be interpreted as a sort of as a territory of a militia, which I think it's really interesting how it kind of supports the two economies rather than one displacing the other.
I noticed in your book that you, I mean, this topic is so interesting. It's such an interesting dimension of your research. We kind of get a 30,000 foot overview of what's happening, from the United States and from newspapers, which is the way that, so many people get access to what, to any kind of purchase on what's happening. You get a 30,000 foot view. But when you get down to it, you have this, incredibly complex sort of interweaving as you're describing. And I remember in the book that you were talking about, and I know this ties directly into what you're saying, I think now, that Altar used to be divided into two it had like two socioeconomic strata, los de arriba y los de abajo. And that was actually a physical geographic descriptor as much as it was, a kind of a socioeconomic one, which is los de arriba were closer to, I guess, the sort of main source of water and up a little bit actually physically higher. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's, I mean, that was way before my time, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I was going to ask, so is that the, and you describe them as kind of the landed aristocracy of Altar. Is that the same, the ganaderos, the same families that you're talking about here?
Some of them are. I mean, some of them go back to the 1800s. Wow. Some of them, they really do. Like they have, these huge states that go back to the 1800s. But some of them are new, like the Pesqueira, who are like, this very wealthy family,
dynastic family, right?
And they are the ones who like closed the San Miguel Gate. Who, by the way, Domingo Pesqueira owns land both in Mexico and in the U.S. I mean, he owns the town of Sasabe in the U.S. Huh. Like he bought the town, like including like the post office and everything. But his family was actually, even though they have that last name that has like resonances in Sonora, they were they kind of got rich in the 60s. This particular branch of the Pesqueiras, and it's not like there is a lot of speculation about whether at some point it involved drugs or not, but they are kind of newer and newer riches than the other ones.
I see.
But yeah, I mean, so I mean, some of these kind of distinctions are still in place, and they go back very long. These kind of social distinctions.
I noticed that in the book too that some, it seems like maybe the time that you got there in the 90s, that, and maybe even to the present, that some people kind of, there's this sort of identity of, pioneers or colonizers in a way, because I know that, big parts of of the Sonoran Desert there were, considered tierras baldias, or kind of an empty space that various, government programs were actually giving land away for people to colonize at one point, which of course those were Atam, Tahana Atam and Hiached Atam lands in that area. So it's really a pretty amazing arc of this history. Now that some of those same families that, were part of that, land dispossession process are now, big landowners in the region, and that they're kind of vying for, or whatever is happening there. They're sort of, entretejidos with some of the drug trade that's happening.
Yeah, no, I spoke about that in this talk I gave at the University of Arizona. Like, I was looking very closely at the changes in patterns of land tenure in the strip, like just along the border, just south of the border, from Sasabe to Sonoita. And I kind of went over these kind of so first the dispossession of Otan lands in Pozo Verde and El Bajío and San Francisquito. And these, it was a very, sorry, I mean, I can't get into a lot of detail, but there is different ways through which, through some of these colonization programs that the government had after the revolution, some of those lands were considered empty, and they were open for claims to form ejidos or form ranches. And this is how some of these ranches along the border came into being. They kind of carved themselves out of the large 19th century states, and they, formed these ranches. But then you have, and by dispossessing, the Otam, which were encroached and, now have even lost possession of Pozo Verde, which is actually an ejido that they own. Still, I mean, formally they are the owners, but they no longer occupy it. But then you have this second sort of moment, like more recently, in which drug traffickers began to acquire those ranchers at the border through different means, like debt or threats, or or simply by buying them, or by getting into sort of deals with the owners, and then somehow something goes wrong with the deal, and they end up like taking the ranch, etc. But so that is like a kind of second wave of dispossession now of the original dispossessor, so to speak. So it's just kind of like these different. But something that I think also is very important is that in Sonora, this kind of rancher pioneer ideology is so strong that it really hides and makes invisible, covers all the violence against indigenous groups. I mean, this is something that I think people in Arizona are perhaps even more conscious of than the people in Sonora. I mean, it's not part of this is not something that we talk about. It's not it's not something that we recognize, that we talk about, that it's we haven't really come to terms with the fact that that this violence exercised upon indigenous groups is very recent and continuous, and and it's the basis for the land claims that all these people have in this region.
I noticed too, apropos of this, what you're saying here, in your book, you talk about this notion that Sonora is a land of equals, and that's a discourse that I've definitely seen in my own research, working in much farther south in Sonora in the Mayo Valley. That seems like it's sort of emergent over a long period of time, but especially in the post-Mexican Revolutionary years, the 30s to the 50s, there's this notion that Sonora is a land of hard work, and that that hard work is something that is a kind of a great leveler, that he or she who works hard has an equal chance of getting ahead. And it's so interesting to me to see that there are so many kinds of parallels in that discourse with the way that with the the ideologies that kind of authorize the settling of the West in the United States.
Absolutely, I think Sonora,
parallels.
has a lot in common with that. I mean, I think, Sonora is kind of the frontier, or like, it's very similar to these kind of Western ideologies in the U.S. Definitely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Um,
I think I remember you writing. You were citing the Sonoran historian Ignacio Almada, who was at the Colegio de Sonora. His
yeah.
great book, Breve Historia de Sonora, kind of talks a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of I don't know. It's so interesting to me that you can really see the ways that the historical processes of land in Mexico are so kind of convergent with what we're seeing in this moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think some of that frontier ideology, it's actually partly what made drug trafficking such an sort of, it was part of like drug trafficking culture or narcocultura, at least, in the shape it took in Sonora, because I mean, ultimately, the choice, back in the day when drug trafficking was actually a possibility, right? When you could try to make it and actually make it in that way.
Mm-hmm.
What it offered was it was a kind of a grace period to a rural lifestyle that was dying, that was no longer sustainable. So that all the money coming from drug trafficking and smuggling was then invested back into ranches that were no longer, sustainable in economic terms. It was invested back into horses and cows and hats and boots and pickup trucks and something to kind of renew the illusion that lifestyle, that ranchero lifestyle, could be, perpetuated, and it allowed people also not to migrate. I mean, I can see it in specific, like in my family, like my father, my uncles, they were, they had to leave town, the village of that, they had to leave it and go to Hermosillo to study high school, and then maybe go to Mexico City to study at university, and never really come back. The only, the option for those who stayed was either the ranch or smuggling, or both, a little bit of both. And so what happened was that they ended up supporting these ranches through drug trafficking. And it was like this ideology of the kind of the independent man, that it's not going to, be salaried or go be part of a bureaucracy, work in an office, but stay in the land. And smuggling is, allowed that to happen, allowed that to, allow them to stay there and kind of like prolong the existence of that ranchero lifestyle.
Mm-hmm. That autonomy, I would imagine, that's so
Autonomy.
prized. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't really talk much in the beginning about the sort of setting the scene of this place. This is in one of the driest parts of the Sonoran Desert. Sustaining a herd of cattle in that area is just not an easy thing to do, right? I mean, there are very few water sources. Can you kind of describe the geography of the place a little bit for us?
Yeah, so it's the most arid part of the desert is actually a little bit to the west, San Luis Rio Colorado, Peñasco, those sections that are actually, like dunes and sand. So here you have, it's certainly desert, and you have, like a sort of mesquite type of, cacti and that type of environment and nature. But what happened was that many of the like 3 or 4 of the presidents of Mexico after the revolution were from Sonora, and they invested a lot of money in the early 20s and 30s in infrastructure, to turn Sonora to make the desert bloom, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So they drill wells and they made dams, and like they had this whole development project that sort of worked for a little bit, but then created the situation of high indebtedness. Like a lot of the ranches were indebted to the Ban Rural, and the prices fell also. So my grandfather, for instance, he grew cotton, and for a while, like cotton was, it was amazing. It was like the white gold. And then the prices fell, and the ranch was indebted, And so like it was a whole sort of, economic and environmental process of decay. And right now what you have is like the overgrazing for sure. I mean, you can see that so clearly when you look at the Arizona Sonora border. When you see land on each side, from a satellite view, I mean, it's so clear that the Sonora lands are overgrazed. Like no one respects the limit of number of cattle that you can have per hectare, and water has also been overexploited. Now we have like mining, which is also a huge component of this kind of decay. I mean, you have huge mines now in Altar and Caborca, like gold mines that take a lot of water, and also a kind of like reluctance among the people to choose crops and methods that are more suitable to a desert environment. So people insist on growing alfalfa and things like that take a lot of water.
Things that fetch a pretty high price on the market, things that generate income. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, one thing I've noticed. So I lived in Sonora in the mid 1990s to the early 2000s, basically, and so I got to see. I was in the south of the state, but I got to see that a similar process taking place where things felt relatively calm, but especially in the latter part of that, and now since 2007, it's a pretty changed landscape, literally and figuratively. Much more militarized, police patrols, pretty constant, all of that is happening. But one thing I've noticed, and I can hear it in your description of the Altar area too, is these sort of intersecting cycles of boom and bust, like that are kind of happening simultaneously. And I mean, to some degree, I think that's been the case for a long time. As you said, especially since the generation of the Sonoran triumvirate, the three presidents triumvirate. But I really noticed it. I have noticed it more and more that you have these different activities coexisting. It's mining and stepped up cattle ranching, and at the same time environmental deterioration. And then drug trafficking. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's things feel very sped up.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think like I've been trying to look at those processes, and something that is interesting to me is that there is an early moment in which the frontier is open, so to speak, like in whatever activity you might be thinking about. So there is a point in which like anyone could enter drug trafficking and try to make it, and like it was relatively open, to kind of personal or individual entrepreneurship. The same thing happened with migration. Like there was an early moment in which a lot of women actually, like got reached by, kind of being the first ones to build hotels and restaurants and guest houses. But then after that early boom moment, you see how it closes, and it becomes controlled by a powerful group, and then sort of people move and try to find a different activity. So I mean, you saw it with drug trafficking was like really clear, like when there's a moment in which it's no longer open for non-professionals, so to speak. Like you have to be a member of an organization that is highly hierarchical, and if you want to be part of it, you're going to receive a salary. You're no longer going to be like a kind of individual entrepreneur. Like you're going to be, like probably part of a bureaucracy, of highly militarized bureaucracy. The same thing happened with gold. I mean, I've been recently working with gambusinos, who are these kind of solitary men who go out to the desert and they find gold by themselves. And like with using these very like kind of old methods of the 19th century, like they find little pieces of placer gold and enough to make a living.
They're placer miners, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you could see that. I mean, also it's sort of like there was a moment in 2012 when like, everyone wanted to be a Gambusino, and like you had all these people who had been sort of like excluded from drug trafficking, who had some money, and so they started like to buy some like, more sophisticated machinery to do it, like, like a small operation still, but like of clandestine mining. And you could see them all over the place, like doing these excavations. And now it has gotten controlled by the mafia. So the mafia now it's in, sort of like regulating access to the gold economy as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have all these kind of different processes of like sort of a boom in which like it's open and everybody kind of like rushes, like these rushes. It's really very kind of like a gold rush. And then, there's a process of kind of ossification or bureaucratization, I don't know what to call it, in which like an organization forms that kind of closes the access and controls it, and people move to some other activity. And of course there is a very high cost in terms of the environment for each one of these activities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I mean, charcoal is a huge one right now.
Yeah, right.
Everybody's doing charcoal, and this is like the mesquite charcoal, which goes to Arizona for barbecues and things like that. And now it's like, again, like people who were in the Gambusino business of like clandestine gold now are producing charcoal.
Do you know the work of Deleuze and Guattari?
I do.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how the stuff you're describing here just seems so so well articulated in part by their theories, and one of the things I keep thinking about is how you have this moment of the sort of open frontier, the nomad frontier in a way, that could be a figurative and literal kind of thing, and then there's this sort of like what do they call it? The state comes in and starts to kind of vampire on all of that. You know what I mean? To kind of impose or figure out ways to take advantage of certain structures within all of that. So it's like they call it the war machine.
Yeah, no, I've read a little bit about it because there is this other anthropologist, I forgot his name, who uses the concept of the war machine to talk about child soldiers in Liberia. I forgot his name, but yeah, I mean, I think the kind of the peculiarity here is that it's not only the state, or at least it's a state. It's a state that is very. I mean, we need to develop our own concept of the state in Mexico to understand what's going on, because it's not I think it's a mistake to think of these local militias and the state as two separate forces. Mm-hmm. I think that to a large extent they co-govern Mexico, like that they know that certain things are under the control of the mafia and certain things are under the control of the state, or rather, you could even think that having these mafias or militias control territories is a form of state control. Also, it's a form, it's a kind of form of indirect rule. I think that's another term that sometimes I've thought, I mean, it's from histories of Africa. Like this concept of the indirect rule was the way in which, like the England or the British Empire govern certain places by using, by proxy, right? By using local powers to control places. Sometimes I think of organized crime as a form of indirect rule, because it's not something that escapes the state or that is beyond the state, because there is so many transactions, just in terms of like just to give you a more concrete example. So it is said that in order for the whole migrant extortion economy to exist in Altar, in other words, in order for the local mafia to be able to charge every migrant a certain amount of money, they have a permit, they have an authorization from the state police and the state government, and they pay that, they pay those authorities. So this is of course all, like, you could call it corruption, but if you decide to sort of look at it as what exactly it is, it's a form of agreement or transaction between state offices and these kind of so-called illegal or criminal militias.
Mm-hmm. In a way, between two interconnected but distinct bureaucracies or sets of bureaucracies, right? Does that seem right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I always give the example that it was so crazy how when the mafia started charging fees to migrants in Alta, they had to keep like, so they were charging different fees to Central American migrants and to Mexican migrants. So they had to figure out whether the person was Central American or Mexican in order to know how much to charge them, which means that they had to have like the kind of the knowledge or the skills of an immigration authority.
Yeah, right.
So they had to be able to tell them apart and differentiate and like request like all these different forms of evidence and proof, and they have to keep track and like actually count them and keep a record and a register of like everything that everybody who was going through at that, which is a very kind of state like activity, right?
Yeah, right. It's so, I just I'm thinking as you're talking about how difficult it is to understand the workings of power in all of these relationships, because, I was thinking about kind of Foucault and the kind of more capillary understanding of power, and how, over time, there's this sort of, I don't know, stabilizations in the great swirl, of power relations and forces. And sometimes certain things grow to become dominant, and then they impose an order, you
Mm-hmm.
know. But it's not just that they impose an order, because they are coming from, or they are in emergent order, and they're also imposing an order at the same time. You know what I mean? There's like a kind of a really difficult tension to grapple with intellectually there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was trying to write about that recently in terms of like, because so from 2010 to 2020, so the last 10 years, so in 2010 is when the charging fees to migrants has started, which is when, this is when I think the process of cartelization or cartelización, as I call it, began, which is this kind of like, process of professionalization of the mafia and of the control, right? So like no longer amateur traffickers, like a professional monopoly sort of militia. This is when it started. And it like in the last 10 years, it has had 5 leaders. And the first 4 died very quickly. So it was, they were, they were killed in different circumstances. And the last one, the current one, has been there for 4 years or 5 years. But he also has kind of carried out these types of like, I don't know, processes of formalizing the structure beyond just the personality cult in a certain way. So it's that I think now it has a much more formal structure, so that even if he's not there, the structure would remain or would survive the occupants of the positions. Like it's almost like in a very short time it became this kind of more formalized bureaucracy, but it also became, it developed an ideology, a very clear, like powerful ideology, which, it's promoted mostly through corridos and music, but it's an ideology that, speaks of a lineage. So he always kind of talks about his dead son, his dead brother, and his compadres who came before him and who died, so that he is now empowered. So there's this kind of like talking about the dead who came before and whose sacrifice basically was the foundation of the current state of affairs. So it's almost like a nationalism, like a
Yeah,
tiny
totally. Right.
nationalism.
That makes a lot of sense, right? So it's a sort of a discourse of belonging that people are, whatever it is, they're moved into, or where they're kind of interpolated, I guess, by.
Yeah, and it kind of center on the question of death as a gift in a certain way, as a sacrifice, right? So it's dar la vida is the term that you would hear in some of these songs, like, my men would give their lives for me, or, like this idea of death as an offering,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is really interesting, because when you see it in relationship to forced disappearance, right, which is the new kind of like, that's another process that it's now taking place, which is a lot of these deaths are not longer just deaths, but disappearances,
Mm-hmm.
which in a certain way takes away from the sicario, from the soldier, from these kids. It takes away the possibility of giving their life, of dying publicly.
I see.
Of having a death that it's recognized publicly and having a funeral and having a song written about them. So like it's like they no longer own even their deaths. Like even their everything has been taken away. Like the life is taken away and the death is taken away because you don't have it a social death. You just disappear. And so it's to me it's kind of like the ultimate form of like extraction of labor exploitation. It's like that's it. Like you gave everything, and you no longer have a territory because you don't have a burial site. Which is a form of territory in a certain way. It's like a place. Like this is something that the Madres Buscadoras always talk about, which is like I want my son to have at least a tumba, a place where I can go and leave flowers.
Mm-hmm.
So to be grounded in the earth somewhere. So I think that I don't know, like forced disappearance in a way, it's together with all of this devastation of the landscape, it's just kind of another form of like erosion. It's like it's just it's like the extraction of everything.
Mm-hmm. You've been banished from any earthly connection in some ways. Well, this is a good moment, I think, to pivot to a second question I have for you. So you've just won the Jose Revueltas Literary Prize. Congratulations!
Thank you.
Very prestigious award. I guess it's on the part of the Instituto de Bellas Artes y Letras. Do I have that right?
Instituto Nacional de Bellas Artes. Yeah.
De Bellas Artes. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And well deserved, I'm sure. I haven't read I guess you have a compilation of essays.
Yeah, no, this idea that I was just talking about of like forced disappearance as kind of as a part of this larger form of extraction and devastation is something that I write about in one of those essays.
Oh, that's right. Okay, so this is in the series of the compilation of essays is called El extravío de los signos.
Yeah.
Ensayos sobre el duelo y porvenir.
Yeah.
I guess the first part's a little hard to translate into English. The loss of signs, 3 essays on grief and future. And the future, how do you have a better way to translate that?
I don't know how I would translate it. I would say, like, I mean, I don't know how I would translate it, but I think the idea is that signs become unintelligible or confusing.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a reference to, so the argument that I'm making there is that, so the Madres Buscadoras who are looking for their missing sons, they look for traces in nature, like indexical traces, like little parts or pieces or little sort of traces of movement in the land, footprints, like these types of like clues, right? Like physical traces. And so one of the arguments that I'm making is that that forced disappearance makes it very difficult to kind of take those scattered traces and turn them into an image or a narration or narrative. In other words, that it kind of that it produces an erosion of meaning, also not only of like the land, but also of meaning and forms of attributing meaning to things, so that it's becoming harder to put together these signs in some kind of coherent image or narrative. This is kind of why the title. And one of the reasons is very practical, is that the Madres Buscadoras, in order for them to be allowed to cross all these kind of internal borders and go and look for their sons, they have to say explicitly and publicly that they are not looking for justice, that they don't want to know what happened, that they just want to know where they are. So they kind of have to renounce to a kind of narrative of what happened. Like, they cannot attribute blame to anyone. They don't want to, like, they have to just say, all I want to do is find them and bury them.
And otherwise they're risking their lives?
Otherwise they'll be risking their lives, or they'll be kind of like, it would be much more difficult for them to get anonymous information, which is one of their main sources, right? It's like they receive anonymous information of where could someone be, but they don't ask any further question.
So the people who are providing this anonymous information, I'm sure they could be a variety of different people, but I guess ostensibly some of them might be people who were involved
Certainly,
in the
yeah.
disappearance.
Yeah, I mean, there is all sorts of sources, but yeah, I mean, they receive, yeah, I mean, people who were involved, who heard about it,
Mm-hmm.
even people from within the police,
Mm-hmm.
who sometimes are also related to the disappearances, right? That's the tricky thing is that, I mean, sometimes they feel more threatened by state forces than by, criminal militias.
So you have in the disappearance, you have an assassination and then the disappearance of the burying of the body, or I guess a variety of different things, right? Sometimes, I mean, dismemberment, right? Sometimes, or can you describe when people find when the Madres Buscadoras find someone, what are the circumstances or the conditions?
I mean, I've seen a variety of cases. I mean, sometimes they find them, very recent, people who have very recently disappeared, been killed and disappear, and that are more or less exposed somewhere. Recently they have been finding a lot of those, corpses that are abandoned in kind of like empty lots or areas, and they just receive a call and they go and because they have such a following on Facebook that they can very easily identify the person, which the government cannot do as quickly. So they are much more effective at identifying these corpses. But then they also found, I mean, one of the most impressive findings of the Madres Buscadoras was in Puerto Peñasco in Rocky Point, near the tourist area. It's very sand there. Like the ground is very easy to dig, and they found an entire mass grave. I mean, it was like 52 corpses that they dug out from there, and it was a combination. I mean, there were women. There were very old corpses. I mean, that maybe 10 years, some very recent ones. I mean, all sorts of findings. And then now also you have one that I write about in my essay. They have been finding in the same pits that are used for making the charcoal. So, like, if you go to the ranches there in the area, you'll see this pit, this kind of like these holes that they dig in the hole. It's like a square pit that it's like maybe like, I don't know, like a meter by 3 meters, and then a little bit deep. And in those where they burn the charcoal, where they make the charcoal, some of those have been turned into crematories, like they burn corpses there. And there is very difficult to find any kind of trace or part that can be used for genetic testing. So, like, and this has been happening all over Mexico, but it's just further complicates things because it's really, really hard to identify.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's like almost a total disappearance.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Yeah.
Wow. It's just incredibly shocking and hard to hear all of this. I just can't imagine. I have no context for understanding what the madres are going through. I mean, it's just...
no, certainly. It's. I mean, I'm amazed at their strength. I mean, just the fact that like they don't stop.
Mm-hmm.
They, like it's just constantly looking for like I mean, they just like they are. That's all they do. Like they are devoted entirely to trying to find them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think there is something really important here, which is that I find it hard to talk about violence in Mexico in the United States and with the American audience.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the kind of the U.S. political spectrum is organized in a way that it kind of doesn't allow you to talk about sort of how terrible the situation is in Mexico, because it's kind of like you have to take parts on either a kind of conservative side, which like if you talk about how violent Mexico is, you might be feeding these kind of racist stereotypes and anti-immigration policies. But then if you don't want to do that, then you kind of have to pretend that nothing wrong happens in Mexico, right? Like it's kind of like I find it very difficult to kind of reject border enforcement and anti-immigration policies, and at the same time, ask the American audience to kind of sort of see and acknowledge the fact that we do have a very terrible situation in Mexico, largely caused by, by a market, by a drug economy that, of course, the U.S. is part of.
Right. I think that's something that is so interesting what you're saying here. I've had that experience myself of talking to people, including people I know pretty well who live in Mexico, who it's difficult to talk to this about. I mean, obviously it's just a hard topic, period. I don't want to be too critical there, but I think that in the U.S., where the border is just such a subject of a politics of fear that it's really hard to touch it, and by extension now Mexico with the drug wars, and then just like somehow that connection between the demand for cheap labor, for inexpensive narcotics, that the demand, that connection, that the demand is fueling so much of this. Somehow it just gets lost in that conversation. I mean, I know what you're saying is even bigger than all of that. So, but I really appreciate you mentioning that. I think it's really important.
I mean, I think sometimes I find that sort of politically oriented people in the U.S. Are more aware of what's happening in Palestine than in Mexico.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, our friend who's a professor at UNAM. Sometimes when I meet with her, I talk about. I mean, I try to read a little bit from Mexican newspapers, and a little bit from the U.S. side as well on Mexico. But the coverage of Mexico in U.S. papers is so sensationalized, and so sometimes I'll tell her something about something that I've read, and she's like, "Oh my God, it's just ridiculous," how blown out of proportion all of that is. It's so common.
Yeah, and it's like these kind of stereotypical notions, like I don't know, like my partner and I always laugh at the fact that whenever you're talking about drug trafficking with with Americans, is that they just talk about the cartel, like this one, like and the cartel came and the cartel did that and the cartel did, and it's kind of like, which cartel? Like, what group are you talking about? Like, what is this thing that you're like the cartel? Like this kind of
right.
I don't know. It's just like a shortcut that doesn't really say much.
I really like how you describe it as a process of cartelization, as opposed to just a kind of a game board or a chess board with all of these groups that just exist, and that have these, whatever, these plazas, this kind of the corridors and the plazas, and that kind of that geography of drug cartels. I mean, if I'm sure you've done this. You Google drug war in Mexico, and invariably you're going to get like these maps. That pop up, and those maps, like most maps, give you a sense of, kind of durability and
knowledge
or stability. Yeah, right, exactly, right, and it's just so shifting.
And the thing is that like those maps are used in the Congress. They are the basis for policy and for foreign policy. And they get kind of confirmed somehow, so these representations somehow become like authorized and they they become the basis for important decisions.
Right, exactly, right. They kind of, maps make realities just as much as they reflect them. I do want to ask you, so you've won the Jose Revueltas Literary Prize just a few days ago. You were notified of that. And I was thinking about Jose Revueltas, and I noticed that in your comments when you accepted the award just a few days ago, that you have a kind of a connection with the Mexican activist, now deceased activist and political philosopher, Jose Revueltas, who's the namesake of the prize. Oh, sorry. If I could just finish that up. And I was thinking, so he ended up in prison. He was ended up to be part of a pretty important part of the student movement in the 1960s. And then, that the massacre, the student massacre, will be 52 years old on October 2nd, I believe. And so I was just thinking a little bit about all of that. Maybe you could talk about your, is that true did I read that right? That you have this connection, or maybe I had that wrong?
Absolutely. Well, through my dad.
Your dad.
Revueltas died a few years before I was born, but he was very close with my dad. And he was much older than my dad, but my dad was part of the student movement in Hermosillo and in Mexico City, and like they used to go visit him in jail, and I think they connected because Revueltas was from Durango, which is it's a northern state, and my dad was from Sonora, and so they had like a kind of a similar sort of nostalgia for this rural desert lands, and they share a lot in that respect. And I just growing up, my dad would tell me stories of him and like all sorts of anecdotes, and I just kind of more broadly, I'm convinced that it is really important to recover the figure and the legacy of Revueltas, because I think it was because of his communist conviction that he has been kind of excluded a little bit from the literary and cultural canon in Mexico. Mm-hmm. And he's like really a major writer, an amazing writer. Like I would say like El Luto Humano by Revueltas, it's kind of the size of Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo. Mm-hmm. And Pedro Páramo became like the Mexican novel, but El Luto Humano is just amazing. And I think it also mattered a lot to me that the prize was named after him, because some of the topics that I was trying to address, which is this kind of relationship between mourning and the possibility to think the future, to imagine or to create a future, is something that he was kind of concerned about. Like I think in the Luto Humano he writes about just the amount of death that the Mexican Revolution caused, like just all this kind of devastation and death, and his concern was like, how do we turn all of that into like an actual foundation of something? How do you turn that into a historical force? Like is it possible? Is there a way to redeem, so to speak, all of that violence and turn it into into something, and into some kind of way towards the future,
some kind of real transformation.
Yeah, real transformation, or simply just, like when it comes to the Madres Buscadoras, I think it's just like, we need to really see that violence, because even in Mexico, I think like we don't, like, all of these deaths are very often like disregarded, or they aren't really mourned. They aren't really mourned publicly. They are mourned privately, but not publicly. There isn't like there's only a few cases like the Ayotzinapa or the 72 from San Fernando who have caused this kind of like, public mourning. Mm-hmm. Like, but like the thousands that are killed every day, they're just kind of like discarded as criminals. Mm-hmm. They are not mourned. Mm-hmm. So I think that's kind of like a huge part of what the Madres Buscadoras are doing is kind of like giving them the status of mournable, not disposable. Like, we need to mourn them. And on the basis of that, we can think of a future out of this kind of like sort of repetition of violence that doesn't take anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Wow, Natalia. Well, I really salute you and thank you for all this incredible work you're doing. I mean, your writing and your activism and, your concern for what's happening and trying to inform other people, while at the same time, using your connections as a scholar, your connections between different worlds to aid people in their quest, to grieve and to kind of create some understanding around what's happening. I just, I think it's really important. So, thank you so much. And thank you for this conversation. I've really, it's been fascinating. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for taking the time to read my book and, have such great questions.
Oh, you're quite welcome. This episode of the JSW Radio Hour is produced by Jeff Banister and edited by Carlos Quintero.